Hello, everybody. Welcome to this conversation. I'm very lucky today. I'm joined by Peter Kalmus, who's a climate scientist and an author, and he's based in Los Angeles, and I'm here in London. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me on for this discussion.
Do you want to give people a bit more of an introduction to yourself first?
Sure. Why not? I grew up, so I've been in the States my whole life. I grew up outside of Chicago, in the suburbs. From an early age, I would say I felt really uncomfortable with freeways and cars and airplanes and the noise, and I was really drawn toward what we might call the natural world or wild places. Had a kind of transformative experience in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in New Mexico when I was when I was a teenager, actually, lying on a trail under the stars and just feeling really connected to everything. It was quite a major moment for me in my life. I was always drawn to science, big questions, wanted to study cosmology, got a PhD in physics and was studying astrophysics. Was with the LIGO collaboration searching for gravitational waves for 8 years. And over that period, I got more and more and more concerned with climate and ecological breakdown to the point where I couldn't concentrate on astrophysics anymore. And I had to switch careers into earth science, which is quite unusual for scientists. And it's quite a big sacrifice in many ways to make a big career change like that. And so I started out studying cloud physics. And more recently, I switched to studying biodiversity. And throughout all of my earth science, there's been a very strong component of remote sensing, which means using satellites and satellite platforms and satellite data to understand and then analyzing that data to understand certain aspects of the Earth system. And so, that's why I'm here having this discussion with you. I am increasingly terrified by what I see in our climate and ecological future. And I have no choice but to speak out. And I try to do that as skillfully and as effectively as I can. But I really am, at the end of the day, just an introverted scientist who wishes he didn't have to do this stuff. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't speak out and try to make as much change and good trouble as I could. So that's why I'm here.
I like what you say about being somebody who'd prefer not to have to do this, because I definitely felt like that at the beginning of XR. I didn't really want to speak. I didn't really want to go and do interviews. I started out doing different direct actions and always sort of passing the phone to somebody else when the radio called, or not really feeling very confident talking. And it's become something of a sort of, like it's part of the work, isn't it? Like having to become a communicator somehow. It's kind of a piece of the work.
Absolutely. It's completely non-trivial too. I mean, I feel like I have two really demanding full-time jobs. So one is just being a scientist, which is really, really hard and takes a lot of time. I don't think I know any scientists that work 40-hour weeks. And then also being a climate activist and trying to figure out ways to create change as effectively as I can. So I've co-founded an app, I've founded something called the Climate Ad Project, which is literally like an ad agency. I'm a scientist. Why do I have an ad agency? I've been involved with XR, helping it get started in Los Angeles, and sometimes with the Sunrise Movement, and political candidates always reach out for me to help get boosted, and writing, and it's really, and I feel like in terms of the activism, there's so much more I can be doing. There's there's things I've tried that didn't work, and there's ideas I have that I'm trying to get off the ground now and see if they're more effective than the things I've been doing. So but I see other people try to speak about climate and climate solutions and kind of climate emotions and activism, and it's such a holistic thing it's quite difficult to do. And I find that I have to be sort of living in it full time. And, I don't want to, I feel like it's important for me to bring my voice to this, it's, say that with as much humility as I can muster, but to not be in this space would leave a vacuum in some at some level. It's great. I think it's great to have as many scientists who are speaking out and kind of sounding the alarm very clearly and explicitly and loudly that we're heading in the wrong direction, and we don't have a lot of time left to change direction. I would actually say that we have negative time left to change, in the sense that from where I'm sitting and from where my vantage point on the Earth system, and where I see the things that we're losing on this planet right now, I think we've already gone too far. And the longer we let things continue heading in this direction, the more we're going to lose. It's as simple as that. And it's been a little frustrating to me to see how reticent the scientific community has been about kind of sounding this alarm explicitly. So yeah, I actually really don't like it. It's time consuming. I've kind of gotten quite taken by gardening and growing fruit trees and keeping bees, and then just doing science and spending time with my family. And I think I'd actually prefer, as just a person, to do those things. But then there's the times you wake up at 3 a.m. in the middle of the night and feel like, sometimes I feel like we're losing Earth. It's almost like it's a patient on an operating table, and it's like the beeps are changed, flatlining, and so sometimes I have this anxiety at night, where I feel like I have to figure out new ways of mobilizing people and pushing this movement faster and creating more change, because the stakes are so high, right? And this is such a singular moment in not just human history, but geologic history, right? So I just can't sit on the sidelines. It's not even a question.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what's interesting what you're saying about how, taking a view that we've already gone too far is kind of really where XR began, from my position anyway, with the messaging, and we used to use this phrase, hope dies, action begins, which myself and my friend Miles found in this, some radical pamphlet that we were sort of gathering lots of different materials and looking at different messages. And actually, the idea that we let go of the kind of perhaps a very sort of mainstream idea of hope, which I think is often used in a way which is like, I hope things can stay the same, or I hope that my life can go back to how I thought it was meant to be.
Or I hope that they figure something out, those other people out there, those inventors or politicians will, figure it out, right? So that I'm off the hook.
Yeah, exactly. And so with that in mind, the first thing that I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about was that, we've got lots of people saying 1.5, is what people have said that they'll stick to, and that, globally, we're clearly not doing that. And that's coming soon, meeting that temperature rise. It's anticipated to come really quite soon. And so as a scientist and as a human being, which you are both, then how does that make you feel in yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I've got so many climate emotions that are kind of, some of them become dominant at certain times, like the anxiety and panic at 3 a.m., which, for me maybe comes every month or two. It's not like every night I'm waking up bolt upright. There's a low level anxiety, which I manage through meditation. Sometimes I feel extremely, extremely angry, and then there's a deep sadness at just my kids' futures, for one thing, for sure. I've got two sons, they're age 12 and 14. And when they were born, that was a major, that's kind of what catalyzed me to transition into climate science and to becoming a climate activist. Because, it's, it's just so, the path we're on is just so dark. It's so bleak. I see tropics that's uninhabitable by humans because it's too hot. It's too humid and hot that our bodies couldn't even survive there. And I see, potentially hundreds of millions of people needing to leave that region and go to cooler areas. And that's just the beginning, So it's we can start exploring that dark vision, but it can be a very hard thing to hold, and it can be extremely overwhelming. Over the last 10 years, I've had moments of really intense grief. They tend to come on really suddenly and unexpectedly, and last for maybe a minute. And sometimes just very intense tears and crying, and this sense of being completely opened up. So that's to me the fascinating thing about grief. Maybe through my meditation practice, I can still, there's part of me that's still observing what's happening when I have these intense emotions. And that grief, I feel like I am the earth, like I am the coral reefs, I am future generations, I am people in vulnerable communities, I am activists who've been murdered over their activism, like all at the same time. Like it's just like everything's just kind of floods into me, and there's no separation. And that so for me, the grief, it's not exactly painful. It's just this cracking open of awareness and feeling, just like feeling it all like at once. And then when that intense wave passes, I usually feel a little bit tired, but also just like the sense of renewed kind of resolution and motivation to keep going, right? So the grief, I don't mind it. It's to me, it's really interesting when it happens, and I can't will it to happen. It just happens when it does. The anxiety is the thing that I have to kind of manage, because it is hard work to articulate the science and the emotions and the kind of the vision for the future, both the dark things that we want to avoid and the positive things that we want to bring into the world. It's hard to articulate that. It's work to write down the words or to say the words. And when I have that anxiety, it causes me to be unable to articulate. I can't write articles. I can't work on a book. It becomes also very hard to even just do science, right? So the anxiety is what can cause me to be sidelined and ineffective and not to be part of the movement. So I don't find it actually useful in any way. And I developed certain ways to manage it. So there's a lot of other kind of maybe more secondary emotions, like maybe regret, regret at not becoming an activist sooner, or regret at not learning how to speak out effectively sooner. One emotion I don't really have is guilt, because it's hard for me to imagine doing more than what I'm doing. And I know I'm still part of the system. I still do emit some CO2. I'm not perfect, but I understand that I'm also a mammal, right? And sometimes I don't get enough sleep. Sometimes I get super stressed. Sometimes there's things going on in my life. So I think I've learned to be kind and know that there's only so far that I can push myself. And so I don't feel guilt. Anyway, yeah, it's a bit of an overview of the emotional side. And I think it's actually quite great that you brought that up, because it's important to talk about this. And there hasn't been a lot of kind of resolution in the discussion over climate emotion. I wrote an article one time where the headline conflated my grief and my anxiety, right? The best medicine, the headline was the best medicine for my climate grief, when I was really in the article talking about climate anxiety. And the two things to me couldn't be more different. Like the anxiety comes from fear and from separation and from like feeling like, I'm not enough. And the grief, I think, somehow comes from love and from connection, and it's very motivating as opposed to demotivating. So if anything, the anxiety and the grief are more opposites than synonyms. And so I think we, just in terms of the broader discourse, there's still a long way to go in terms of actually discussing these emotions in a useful way. And if we can't discuss them, and if we can't sort of categorize them and observe them, then it's very hard to manage them. And if we can't manage them, then they can, these emotions can really become our enemies and hold us back. But if we start to understand them and understand how they work, then they can actually become allies. Like I believe that righteous anger can be an extremely powerful movement building emotion. If it's channeled in the right way, and it's, it's brought to bear in a public way, that it's attention getting, right? So if you're Greta, or if you're Emma Gonzalez talking about gun control, and you see what's being lost, and you see how the authorities are ignoring you and being condescending, and you sense the lack of change that's just ambient, and it makes you very angry, and you can draw on that when you're behind a microphone, and it's attention. I mean, everyone, especially if you're a young person, right? There's something about adults, wanting to. There's still something that we agree on as a society, right? Which is adults should be protecting youth and should be making a better future for youth. So it's that righteous anger can really bring attention and make people stop dead in their tracks, right? Because there's all this distraction, and you need something that cuts through that distraction. And so yeah, we should be discussing emotion more than we are, and having that discussion in maybe a more articulated way.
Yeah, great. I totally agree, and I think that was also something that I think Extinction Rebellion sought to do quite intentionally, was to open up a space for grief and to mm-hmm. connect emotionally with this situation in a way which, like, often people just weren't,
That's right.
And because the nature of some of the data is scientific, and that is cold, rational information, not something that sort of moves the average person's heart, and data and numbers and all of that stuff, which is, pretty cold delivery of info for people. And then also, I think because people have been kind of avoiding the way that it feels to confront mm-hmm. this, right? Like the whole organization around people needing hope, and the third sector certainly, and the campaigning space before XR sort of came on the scene, seemed to always be saying, oh, give us a bit of cash and we've got this, we're gonna save this bit of the rainforest, or we're gonna outlaw this bit of plastics usage, or we're gonna fight these winnable campaigns, which are quite small. And the sort of perceived wisdom there was like, people need to see something that succeeds, so we have to do this in like tiny chunks. And to take on the magnitude of the actual reality of the crisis, it requires a massive amount of emotional labor. And I felt at the beginning like the people who came on board to do the work with us were in some ways shouldering a lot of emotional work on behalf of other people who were not doing it, or were not ready to do it, or hadn't heard the information yet. But it felt very important to me that this is about grief, and also mm-hmm. in that way, it's about realizing this as an existential threat, right? So as an existential organization, which somebody somebody told me that that was what their head of their school said when they had a banner, and someone said, you can't have that banner here, that's a political movement. And they said, no, it's not, it's an existential movement, actually. So we can have XR's banner here in our school because this is the nature, is existential. And it's quite different when you start to look at it in that way, isn't it?
Also, I think that grief, there's a really important relationship between grief and climate denial. And I think that even a lot of people who accept the science, there's the hardcore deniers who say it's a hoax. And I've not ever found it very fruitful to actually talk to them. And luckily I think there's still a relatively small fraction of the population that's really in that state of denial. Although, unfortunately, I think it can actually grow. Like, it's not guaranteed that it's going to get less over time. But there's an even larger group of people who agree with the science. They can read about the science. They can talk about the science. They can say some of the facts. They understand how it works. They have an intellectual understanding of projected impacts. But yet, I think they're still at some level in denial. They still think we can get out of this, for example, with more technology, with green growth, without making radical changes. They tend to react very badly if somebody even tries to talk about or think about or discuss the possibility of societal collapse. So that's, to me, that's a litmus test. Like, that's a way you can sort of tell if somebody's still in this level of kind of soft denial, is if they have, their worldview depends on a sense of future stability, that they can't let in the possibility that that's not guaranteed, right? And for me, at least, coming out of that denial, it's not like necessarily something that suddenly happens. It's you get better at it with time, and I'm sure in some ways there's still things I'm in denial about. But the grief is the thing that that helps you come out of that denial. It's the connecting thing, like I said. And I think that the part of the reason people are in that soft denial is because they're repressing that grief and they're trying to hold it away, because the grief by its nature is a kind of loss of control. You don't do any work to feel the grief. You just stop doing work to keep it from coming. And then it sort of washes over you like a wave. And I probably, people's experiences are different, but for me, it's an incredibly cleansing wave. It tends to sweep out all of this uncertainty, sweep out sort of cowardice, sweep out just confusion. It's very clarifying. It orients you to a purpose that I think couldn't be more meaningful as a human living on the earth right now. So it's not, I don't really think it's a bad thing. It's sad. It makes you sad. I think it changes you forever. I don't think that in this lifetime, I don't expect to ever overcome that grief. It's something that you live with, but it's not a handicap. It's almost more like a superpower. And it's similar to losing a loved one, right? It changes you, but you learn to live with it, and it deepens you. It makes you more human. It increases your capacity for compassion and for love and for gratitude and for the sense of how precious this all is, right? And how impermanent it is. So it's like it makes your heart bigger, right? And that's what we need more of right now. So, but maybe it's kind of frightening to people. So they try to keep it from coming in. I've talked to people explicitly who've told me, like, they don't know how they can do their job if they let those emotions in. But again, I think they're not talking about the climate grief, which I think helps us be more effective and more human and more able to deal with what's happening right now. I think they're more talking about the anxiety. So yeah, I encourage people to not repress the grief and to have a good cry about what's happening, and to talk to each other. One of my kind of many projects that I don't have enough time to devote to is something called climate cafes. We're partnering with some climate psychologists, and it's not even really a project. Like, I just want people to know that they can meet in groups. I guess now probably more remotely with this pandemic, but eventually it's much better to do it in person, and to just go around in a circle of a small group of people and say how this all makes you feel, and maybe let the tears flow, and listen deeply to the other people as they're talking, because you'll learn from them too, and it might open up your own emotions that you didn't even know that you had. And I especially encourage scientists to do this exercise, because scientists tend to be maybe among the, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but maybe among the more emotionally repressed groups of people. and I think it's very helpful. I really do think that scientists, in terms of communicating this to the public and raising sense of emergency and creating positive change, scientists are extremely important. And we didn't sign up to do this. We didn't sign up to create change. We didn't sign up to be activists. But unfortunately, the public, we are the experts on changes to the Earth system, and these changes are dangerous. They're dangerous to society. They're dangerous to humans. They're dangerous to future generations. They're dangerous to our forests and our marine ecosystems and to all life on this planet. They just are. That's a fact. That's incontrovertible. And we are the keepers of these facts and of the kind of this dangerous future more than any other group of people. We have the front row seats to these dangerous Earth system changes that humanity and growth, the kind of growthism, this capitalistic system that society has become organized around over the last few hundred years, is causing this dangerous change. And we see it, and the public sees us. We're the mediators of those future projections as far as the public is concerned, right? Because we're the ones studying it day in, day out. We have the PhDs in it. We're doing the research on it. And the public looks at us and says, all right, so these are the people that are the keepers of that particular expertise and knowledge. They don't seem very freaked out about this. They're showing these plots. They sound bored about it. So they're not freaked out. So I'm not going to be freaked out about it. I got a million other things to worry about. My kids failing math class, the rent's due in 2 days. There's a pandemic. My parent is sick. Whatever. There's a million things going on. So everyone's overloaded. That's part of this, in my opinion, part of this capitalist system that we're in, kind of overloads us in that way. And so they're looking for an excuse not to worry about climate and ecological breakdown. And if the keepers of that knowledge don't appear concerned, then why should they be concerned, right? So I think as scientists, we have to be willing to courageously tap into our emotions. How do these facts, how does this research actually make us feel? Because if we can't tap into those emotions, then we can't express those emotions. And if we can't express those emotions, then we're using just a tiny bandwidth of our humanity to try to express what's happening to the planet. We're just using the intellectual, factual part of our brain, which the older I get, the more I realize it just seems like smaller and smaller and less powerful, right? 10 years ago, I thought it was really powerful. And now I think it's like almost negligible. It's important to know what's happening, right? But it's not the way to create change, is not just by spouting off facts. I've tried that for a long time and it's never worked well for me. So yeah, it's hard to do. And I hope, probably not doing a great job of convincing other scientists to try by making it seem hard, but I hope everyone, I do hope more scientists try, and some of them are, and you learn as you go, and you get more confident about it, and you take risks, and it seems scary when you take those risks to speak out, because the culture is so kind of it's so weak, right? The culture of speaking out in science, it's the pathways are not etched very strongly, so it feels frightening, but
yeah,
you do it and you get better at it.
Well, that's one of the things that I've got on my list of things to ask you about, is kind of how I think many scientists have been quite fearful of the speaking out, whatever shape that takes. and even afraid of being seen as like a political actor, right? Which you obviously are, because you're a human being and you're a citizen and you have a family and whatever, you know. And so do you think, do you feel like we're moving out of the time when a deeply concerned human being who happens to be a scientist can just be discredited with the term alarmist, or you know, sort of scolded within their community for thinking that they actually have a sort of a civic duty as well as a duty to their discipline?
Yeah, I think as climate catastrophes intensify and become more frequent, as they are doing and as they will continue to do, you know, the facts on the ground, the stuff that's actually happening, the storms and fires and crop yield losses and climate migrants and floods, you know, and tipping points and ice sheets and Arctic ice and ecosystems, it all does get more alarming just by its nature. And so, yes, I think it is becoming more difficult to discredit scientists who speak out as alarmists. And you know, I embrace the term because I think it's highly rational at this point to be sounding an alarm, and I think more people should be sounding the alarm. And at this point, I don't feel like there's, to me, a lot of risk in embracing that term anymore. And I think other scientists are realizing that too, that they're saying, yeah, well, of course we're sounding the alarm. We should be sounding the alarm. This is alarming stuff. So I think it's still, you know, it's obviously really important to be extremely careful to not exaggerate the science. And that's, if you're seen as exaggerating the science, then I think it's easy to become discredited. And I think that's probably not necessarily a bad thing. And you know, I've seen kind of bad science in the environmental movement for a long time. You know, the film Cowspiracy, for example, was basically based on junk science. And once that goes out, once that misinformation goes out, so that film in particular said that, claimed that 51% of greenhouse gas emissions were from animal agriculture, which was a, you know, remarkably precise claim, you know, not 52%, not 50%, but 51%. And it was completely based on junk science. But once it goes, it's the real answer is closer to 15%, maybe 20%, which is still huge, absolutely huge. And so, you know, the film could have made its points with the correct science just as well, in my opinion, much better. And once that misinformation goes out there, it's very, very hard to pull it back. And then I still see those incorrect statistics coming up over and over. And then we have to waste time trying to, we're on the same side, but we're arguing about whether it's 15 or 51%. It's
yeah, so that ends up
a waste of time.
Having the wrong arguments with the wrong people, doesn't
right.
it? That's like happening so much.
It's very important to have a shared set of facts, and that's the way science works. And you know, they get refined over time, and maybe error bars get smaller over time. But there has to be a good faith effort to use correct procedures and correct math and correct kind of peer review and reproduction of studies, and consensus is actually really important in science, right? Because if somebody says something and someone else says, hey, your method is wrong, or hey, I can't reproduce that, but I've reproduced this, and then a whole bunch of other people agree with that second person, that's the way science works, right? And because we're trying to find out unknown things about nature. That's what science is. And you're going into this, you know, dark room and trying to turn on the light and describe what you see. And so there has to be kind of shared methodology and shared facts. That's extremely important. Otherwise, we just become, you know, we devolve into sort of arguing and disagreement and tribalism, right? So science is extremely important for as kind of dispelling these kind of these darker human impulses, which kind of lead us into you know, infighting and disagreement and confusion, right? And we don't have time for confusion now. We have to have agreed upon sets of facts, right? So and you know, as far as science communication goes, in my opinion, there's no reason to exaggerate whatsoever the alarming facts of climate and ecological breakdown. You know, even staying well within the consensus, and you know, which tends to be a little bit more conservative than the latest and greatest research, right? That's coming out. Partly because there's often like a time lag of several years to build that consensus, and things are breaking down so rapidly now that even a few years means that those data are already kind of old, and things have, and Earth systems have progressed into an even deeper state of degradation, right? So there's no need whatsoever to exaggerate.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that all the time, actually, from different scientists as well in Extinction Rebellion. And obviously, if you know, I'm in the media team, so if we put something out which is feels slightly wrong to somebody in the scientific community, but makes sense to a normal person in a different way, this is something that I'm trying to wrestle with at the moment with some of the XR scientists, is to try and work out how to run like a creative workshop space in a way where we can like try and experiment with different ways of saying things, because the specifics of the language for the scientific community are highly precise, aren't they? And for the average person, the way that they communicate is not using that high precision around language. And I think it's a really interesting kind of challenge to try and make sure that we're having the biggest impact possible, and we're not underselling the risk, for example,
Exactly.
because we're trying to like keep the scientific community happy with our choice of linguistics. But when you're trying to communicate on risk, then I think that's where this becomes quite interesting, because you know, there is no certainty to a lot of this work on sort of trying to project the risk, but it's very important that we take the risk highly seriously. And I think be interesting to hear what you think in terms of I think XR started off with a very interesting collaboration between people from different disciplines, for example, who you know, were variously people with PhDs, people who'd done very, very deep research on movements, people who'd done huge amount of direct action, people who were world-class designers and communicators. And that like overlap of all of those different disciplines, I think, was extremely bore very good fruit in a way. And I think that sort of combination, we were very lucky that the people who came together at the time worked so well together and brought all of those different sort of things that they bring. And I'm always kind of interested in how much the science, you know, can be complemented or maybe even sort of advanced into different like narratives or different like ways of communicating stuff. And particularly, I'm sort of really fascinated by this problem of like communicating risk, and at what point do you become the alarm ringer? Because, you know, to some people say this is how you communicate risk, but in my mind, the way you communicate risk is like you scream, "Get out the fucking road!" Like, you know, like that's how you communicate risk, right?
100%.
And then we get presented with this difficulty, I think, of this being a very long-term emergency as well. And so we can't just be in that, we can't be in that screaming stage all the time. And yeah.
I think there's 3 layers here. So there's the scientific layer, which can say like, you know, 1.5 degrees Celsius of mean global heating, we're at risk of losing the Greenland ice sheet. And you know, or maybe Antarctic ice sheet instability, for example, just to take one example. And you can look at other tipping points like the Amazon rainforest. And then the science can try to model out, you know, what the uncertainty range is by you know, at this level of warming or this level of warming. And it can tell you, like, you know, 1.5, we think there's this range of risk. At 2 degrees, we think there's this range of risk. That's the science layer. Then there's then that has to be translated into what that means for humanity, right? And you kind of like, how risky do we feel that is, and how do we respond to that risk? I mean, I would say if you're living in Miami or some other low level area, and you're invested in that area and you like it and you don't want to lose it, then you should be, sounding the alarm about that, right? You should say, wait a second, okay, this fact means I'm going to lose my home and we're going to lose this city, and you could have such and such implications, right? So I'm going to sound the alarm, like this is bad. And then there's a third layer, which has to do with, all right, so what should we do about it? Like, what policies should we enact? How should we move society to try to deal with this risk? And science can't really address the second layer or the third layer. I can just say, here's a fact. Here's what we think is going to happen. Take policy, for example. There's a lot of people, say in the United States, who would look at the same set of facts. You could have two sets of people. One would say like, oh, well, okay, we're going to lose all these low-lying areas. The Western forests are going to burn down. We're not going to have, very many wild places anymore. We're going to lose this many species to extinction. All right, that's fine. But we value jobs, we value growth, economic growth. We think that we can innovate around those things, right? So the word value is what's really important here. Then this other group will say, well, hold on a second. We love these species, we love these wild animals. We don't want to see all of the poor people and the people in frontline communities and, indigenous peoples and communities of color are going to be disproportionately affected. And we value that. We think that there's things that are worth saving that we're going to lose. So we should take this set of actions instead of just ignoring it, or instead of just prioritizing, say, GDP growth, for example. So two sets of people. So assuming we can agree upon the facts, right, which is a baseline. So until a few years ago, until kind of the rise of Trump and social media and conspiracy theories and Kellyanne Conway's famous alternative facts, right? Before all of that happened, I thought at least there was a shared baseline of facts. But even when you have a shared baseline of facts, which is an important thing to have, you still have different groups of people who have the same facts, but have completely opposing, completely divergent views on what those facts suggest we should do, because they have different values, all right? And science doesn't speak to those values. So that's why, as a communicator, I think it's super important also to be able to speak as a human, or as a citizen, or as a parent, because those are the parts of my being where the values resonate, right? And so I can say, all right, I have a pretty good understanding of these facts. I'm thinking about them all the time, publishing papers on them, doing research on them. And here's how those facts map through my brain and my values into this set of ideas. Here's how we should talk about it, and maybe here are some policies that we should do. And I've been chastised for suggesting policies, which people say, you're a scientist, you're not a policy expert, you don't have a PhD in policy, which I think is absolutely wrong-headed to silence any citizen, whether she's a scientist or not a scientist, because here's the thing about policy experts. Any policy, like I just said, is coming from that person's values, that person's ideology. So I think that I couldn't disagree more with leaving policy choices and policy suggestions to so-called policy experts. I think that's fundamentally what it means to be a citizen, is to express our opinions on policies, because that's how we make decisions. And we see time and again now also that the people make much better choices, in my opinion, because my value is the planet, right? And my value is a better life for everyone, right? A more equitable healthcare for everyone. Healthcare is a human right, water is a human right, clean air is a human right, and a sustainable planet for future generations. Those are my values. And fortunately, the majority of people in the United States and around the world also share those values. Now, who doesn't share those values? Let's think about this. Corporations, the ultra rich who are out of touch, and the politicians that they've captured through their money. So the capitalists, basically, the growthists, the people and institutions who want growth at all costs, even if it means destroying the planet, destroying workers, taking away our rights, taking away our healthcare, basically turning average people into wage slaves, and causing them to leave. So those capitalists do not share my values and the values that the majority of the people share. So, and guess what? They tend to capture policy experts as well, because it's very convenient for them to have the expert with all the alphabets after her name, saying incremental policies that allow them to keep enclosing, to keep extracting, to keep accumulating at the grave costs of the planet and of everyday working class people. That's why it's super important, I think, for citizens to exercise their right to express opinions about policy, right? Otherwise, we let those, the corporations who have so much influence over the legal system because of campaign contributions and lobbying, and the experts that they kind of pay to provide the message that they want, the media is captured too, right? So if citizens and scientists aren't allowed or we're shamed about expressing our policy opinions, then we just cede that space to the growthists, and that's what's driving this crisis in the first place.
Yeah, totally. And I think, it's really interesting from talking to you and looking at some other people in the scientific community now who seem like they've been able to zoom out and look at the political reality that they're living with, look at the nature of our economy and how it works and what it's doing. And just whilst you were talking, I sort of remembered one of our spokespeople, Liam, who was on a radio show, quite a shitty radio show in the UK during our rebellion, and knowing that this campaign's coming up of people pushing Money Rebellion in the UK, which is financial disobedience and strikes, money strikes and stuff. The interviewer said to him, but Liam, you want to destroy capitalism? And his response was, capitalism is destroying itself. Don't you understand that that's happening? And so when you see the sort of when you see your community particularly sort of taking a step back and looking at this systemically, obviously it's very, very present for people right now, matters of social justice, inequality, racism, how all of this is kind of tied up in a very neat web, really, with the sort of capitalistic reality and then our political reality right now. What do you think about people being increasingly, do you feel like people are increasingly able to sort of take a bigger system view in that way and allow that to ferment? Is it changing people's hearts and minds and stuff?
That's a good question. It's a little unclear to me. I feel like the progressive left is much more aware of how all these things connect now and how they lead sort of almost inevitably to climate and ecological breakdown than they were in 2011 during the Occupy movement. So at that time, the progressive left was very aware of economic inequality and racial inequality, and they're even more aware of that now. But at that time, I don't think there was a clear sense of how that connected to climate and ecological breakdown, or that climate and ecological breakdown was as high of a priority. Now I think it's right up there with everything else. So that's actually, that's pretty good progress over the last 9 years. Although, when you put that in the time frame of carbon budgets, we have, I would say we have 9 years to decarbonize in first world nations. And instead of decarbonizing, we're still kind of increasing emissions and increasing economic growth. So in some sense it's social progress, in other sense it might not be quite quickly and happening quite quickly enough. To unpack a little bit, I'm not against having an economy and I'm not against having exchange. I'm not necessarily against money. It's problematic in some ways. I'm certainly not against having restaurants and businesses and fulfilling human needs. I don't think we should all live in caves. I'm not against healthcare. The thing that I'm against is this kind of raw gravitational accumulation of capital, this debt kind of trap of, you know, needing to have kind of 3% per year growth of GDP to service debt and to, you know, to kind of appease shareholders so that capital doesn't go somewhere else. And how that's been packaged to us as trickle-down economics. And we've been kind of brainwashed into accepting that somehow in order to have an economy, we need this kind of gravitational capital accrual system, which, you know, I think the pandemic has been kind of apocalyptic in the sense that it's lifted a veil just in terms of how much suffering and death this capital accrual causes, right? So for example, in the United States, we have a for-profit healthcare system, which means that hospital shareholders, corporate shareholders are prioritized, and making profit is prioritized over giving care to a sick person, right? That is insane when you think about it. Just baldly insane. And I think more and more people now are realizing how insane that actually is. There's certain things in our society, in our economy, that shouldn't be able to be enclosed by capitalists for profit, right? Because all kinds of that's why I think that's probably why the U.S. healthcare system is so much less effective than you know, healthcare systems in Europe, and many times more expensive per capita at the same time, is because all of that money and resources, and it's not going towards helping people, it's going towards into the ultra rich, which they've got this huge pile of money. I think of it as like a black hole, like it's got its own gravity, because that money gets invested and then it turns into more money, right? And it grows exponentially in this, what's the word, you know, when you know, you're getting growth on the growth, you know, incrementally every year. It's exponential. I just think of it as an exponential function, but economists have their own word for that kind of growth. So it's not linear growth. And it very quickly, you start going up this scale. If this is time and this is the amount, it just starts to shoot up until it's almost going straight up, right? And that's exponential growth, and that's sort of where we are. And those huge piles of radioactive capital, they just keep getting bigger, and you get billionaires. We're on track to have the first trillionaire pretty soon, right? And it's just like a magnet that sucks all of the wealth toward it. And then it's so trivial for it to buy the Washington Post, which Jeff Bezos did, becomes trivially easy. You can buy the media with such a small fraction of your wealth. You can fund campaigns and lobbyists with such a tiny fraction of your wealth, that this black hole, you know, starts to warp the legal system, warps the political system, warps the media and information system. It captures it, right? So that's what I'm against. And at the same time, you can't decouple it from natural resource use and from waste. And so you see global GDP growth going up like this, in lockstep with natural resource use, in lockstep with CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, right? In lockstep with extinction and loss of wild spaces and loss of biodiversity. So it's all connected. You can't, and we literally live on a finite planet. As a physicist, it absolutely blows my mind that people don't understand that. And so, you know, we're already, by almost any measure that you care to look at, we're already beyond sustainable levels of resource use and waste production. So this global cumulative capitalist economy that we have is already bigger than it can be to sustain on this earth. And it's growing at 3% per year, which is what, like about a 30-year doubling time, maybe even a little bit less than that. So by mid-century, it's going to be twice as big, right? And then 25, you know, by the end of the century, it's going to be like 8 times as big as it is now, almost 10 times as big. So you quickly realize that it's going to, it can't keep going like that. It can't. One way or the other, it will end. Whether we you know, kind of coordinate and choreograph that ending and do it in a sensible way or a quasi-sensible way, or whether it just happens on its own in a very chaotic dangerous, frankly deadly way, right? It's almost like it's like a diesel engine that's in that cycle where it's burning its own oil and it goes out of control. It just goes faster and faster and faster and faster until the bearings fail, or until it mechanically fails from just those centrifugal forces and flies apart, right? And does a huge amount of damage, destroys itself in the process, like your colleague was saying, right? That's what it's doing. So I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not against economy, I'm not against business, I'm not against people having jobs. I think that people assume that we have to organize our socioeconomic system in this capital accrual way, which is literally killing us, right? People don't have healthcare. The stock market's soaring, right? It's not trickling down though, because food lines in the US are longer than they have been, I think, in my whole life, right? So poverty, malnutrition, lack of healthcare, it's all on the rise. Depression, opioid addiction, right? That was a way that some capitalists said, I can make money by basically getting people addicted to this drug, right? So it's just, we don't have to organize our society this way. There are other ways to do it. And we literally have to do that reorganization. Otherwise, we're going to slam past, we're already past these ecological limits, kind of towards going into this regime of overshoot. And the suffering and the irreversible nature of the damage that we're doing to the biosphere, it's irreversible on a timescale of millions of years, which for human life and for the lifetime of civilizations and for the lifetime of our species is essentially permanent, right? It's irreversible.
Yeah.
So yeah, the planet will recover after 10 million years, which is the recovery timescale of biodiversity after a mass extinction. But that's completely irrelevant to you, me, our kids, civilization, right? So it's effectively irreversible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder, do you know the work of Bruno Latour, a French thinker and writer? He came up with this term, the critical zone, which is quite, I think, interesting, because I think what he's attempting to do by recognizing that we live in this very thin slither of atmosphere around this big planet, which often feels like the planet is very big, but actually the space that we can inhabit is tiny comparatively. We don't really know very much about like the deepest depths of the ocean. We can't live in the sea. We can't live at the top of the highest mountains. We've really got this space, which, in terms of like an operating space for humanity, which people have used in their sort of measurements of whether or not we've gone past certain limits. I think recognizing it as a sort of operational space is kind of helpful theoretically, but it doesn't actually paint a picture that you can viscerally sort of understand. Whereas his description of this critical zone that we have to like recognize that we're not that many miles away from like the deadly vacuum of space, and we've only got so many inches of topsoil, which is critical, and we're totally fucking it. And actually that makes the whole thing feel very tangible and quite like it's limited, right? So this idea that we are actually finite beings, and we do exist in a finite landscape of
As an astrophysicist, I really get that, because this is such a precious oasis in a very kind of cold and in some ways violent cosmos, right? Carl Sagan's pale blue dot was genius to just show how precious this little oasis is. And then the other side of the equation is I don't think people understand just how big 1 billion is. So I challenge anyone to try to count to 1 billion. or at least to to estimate how long that would take you, how many years, how many centuries. I haven't even done that calculation. But so there's almost 8 billion humans. It's a tremendously huge number. I mean, have you seen that plot of just biomass, mammalian biomass, like how much of it is in humans, just the mass of our bodies versus our livestock versus all the other wild mammals on the planet? It's crazy, right? It's just this, you get this huge mass of humans and their livestock and this tiny little blip of other mammals. So we're literally eating our way through this planet. people don't understand, again, how big a billion is in terms of $1 billion. And these billionaires now, they're becoming 100 billionaires, and pretty soon they'll become 1,000 billionaires, which is a trillionaire. They could literally solve, world hunger permanently if they wanted to. And don't get me started about enclosing agriculture, right? In the United States, and I think in many other countries, almost half of the food that's grown and produced is literally just thrown into a landfill where it turns into methane, and which is a very strong greenhouse gas, right? Much stronger than CO2. Well, you have this, 40 to 50% of food waste, and then you have people that don't have enough to eat. Well, why is that? It's because, again, it's enclosed by capitalists for profit. I think the current scientific thinking is that if we stopped cold turkey now, which we can't, of course, but if we could, we might still have some shot of staying under 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating. So there's a few tenths of degree baked into latency and into kind of the aerosol effect. So if we stop burning fossil fuels, we don't emit as many aerosol particles, which can reflect incoming solar radiation. So they're like little tiny mirrors in the atmosphere that keep it a little bit cooler than it otherwise would be. So if you take those two things into account, we might peak out somewhere close to 1.5 degrees Celsius of global heating. I'm not sure exactly, maybe a little bit less than that, maybe a little bit more. But the bigger problem, in my opinion, is that even if we stabilize temperature, as long as we expect to continue and again, I don't know, like it's hard to talk about this because I feel like the rest of society hasn't really caught up yet. So, it is quite possible to get canceled by talking about this. We have to stop accruing, this accrual of huge gobsmacking amounts of capital among the wealthy, right? To say that, is still a little bit an unpopular thing to say. On Twitter, I get people coming out in my responses and I literally defending billionaires. If I say we should tax billionaires out of existence and use that money to fund a green transition, for example, and to fund healthcare for all, et cetera, they'll say, no, we need the billionaires. They earned that money. It's theirs. They got it because they're super smart, right? Which is such bullshit. But people are still so indoctrinated and they're so attached to capitalism because another way of organizing our economy hasn't really been defined adequately yet. So it's just kind of a big question mark, I think, for most people. And so they assume that if we don't have capitalism, we're just going to go back to living in caves, which couldn't be further from the truth. But I think there was a major step a couple of years ago when the climate movement turned into the climate justice movement. And that was critically important because so I've been a climate activist for 15 years, and for 12 or 13 of those years, all of the activists I saw around me were basically white. Most of them were kind of retirement age because they had time. And I was, at that time, like I was mainly active in a group called Citizens Climate Lobby, like 10 years ago. And I kind of realized like, this isn't a movement. This is basically kind of a bunch of older, mostly retired white people talking about stuff. That's different. That's quite different than a movement. And then, a few years ago, it was reframed. So a lot of people, a lot of different groups did fantastic work reframing it as the climate justice movement. And I think that helped it. That was there are several things that helped the climate movement really take off over the last few years. But I think that was crucial. And that led us to, having Green New Deal proposals, which basically say, we need to electrify everything and we need to get that electricity from wind and solar and storage. And that's going to create jobs. And we need to make sure that there's a equitable transition away from the dirty fossil fuel industry and help those people find new jobs. And and transform society. This very kind of bright vision of like new infrastructure that's green infrastructure. Fascinatingly, none of these Green New Deal proposals say anything about ending this growthism that I talked about, for lack of a better word. We can call it growthism. And they don't even talk about, capping fossil fuel production. To me, like there's many crises, but one of the most immediate is the planet's overheating, right? And that's killing a lot of stuff and really destabilizing ocean currents. I mean, it's just, once you start reading about all the stuff that that excess heat is doing, it's crazy. What's driving that excess heat obviously is mainly burning fossil fuels. Like I think about, well over 3/4 of the driving force of that excess heating. It's also a few other greenhouse gases and cutting down forests. Those are the, as I mentioned before, animal agriculture is also a driver, partly because it results in cutting down forests. So we, if we're in an extinction crisis, if we're facing food shortages and water crises and migrant crises, infrastructural crises that could possibly cause some form of societal collapse. And I'd love to try to talk a little bit about what that might look like. But if we're facing that and the cause is mainly burning this fossil fuel, then shouldn't our plans at some level say we have to stop doing that? We can't allow these few people, these fossil fuel capitalists, to still be creating enormous profits for themselves at the expense of us all. Like, to me, like nationalizing the fossil fuel industry and then starting to ration it and ramp it down and like, eliminate new production, for example, that's all, to me, that's no brainer. Like, if you have this huge risk of losing everything, and this is the cause, and yeah, the governments of the world are still, encouraging more growth. They're still exploring more. They're drilling in the Arctic. They're fracking faster than ever. So it's a quite a remarkable situation we're in. And so I think the next step that the climate movement really has to make, the climate justice was a fantastic step. That was, I think that it's really hard now that we're in the climate justice movement to see how we could possibly have a strong movement without that. I think the next thing that has to happen is it has to recognize that the real enemy, even more than the fossil fuel industry, is this growthism thing that we're all indoctrinated with through school, that we can't imagine not doing 3% per year.
I just want to ask you, because you've just recently put your name alongside hundreds of other academics signing a letter calling for people to keep open the conversation around potential collapse. And I know that you're interested in, keeping alive the conversation about how this, risk amplifier that climate is can bring about, in theory, the collapse of civilization, the collapse of our systems. And so looking at this as like a necessary dialogue, which needs to be able to happen, otherwise we're sort of pretending that it's like not possible, and then we go, oh shit. Then in terms of like having that conversation kind of alive, first, can you just like describe what you think is meant by collapse when it's used in this way? Because I think in some ways the term in of itself, because I think our sort of visual mind probably thinks, oh, like a building collapse. Like it feels like people think there's going to be like someone hits a button and then like
everything ends
and it powers off. Like
the planet explodes.
The internet goes off, and then and then the asteroid
meteor. Yeah, exactly.
So what do you actually see as the collapse? What does that term mean, first of all? And then let's talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so first of all, I didn't think it would be very controversial to sign that letter, which basically just said, let's be able to discuss this. We should be discussing this. I'm like, yeah, we should be discussing this because there's certainly a risk here. I think it would be, it's quite naive to assume that the risk of societal collapse is identically zero. I don't know exactly what number to put to that. I don't think anybody does, which is why one of the reasons it's hard to talk about. And you're right. I think one of the first discussions that has to happen is what might we even mean by this phrase, societal collapse? And now, there might be academics who think about this for a living. I'm not really one of them, but I've thought about it informally for 15 years since I've been a climate activist. And I would say that probably to me, you don't have to posit something earth-shattering. You just have to take trends that we see right now in the world right now around us, and just kind of let them keep going in the same direction. So everything's a trend, right? Temperature is going up, sea level rise is going up, ice sheets are going down. You have these trends. That's the problem with global heating, which is driven by this trend of emitting more and more every year. And same thing with those trends, which keep, there's no new normal. You're just on this escalator towards hotter temperatures and less ice and higher seas and less forests on the planet and less species on the planet, et cetera. So those trends all put mounting pressures. Every day, the pressure on our systems gets a little greater and a little greater and a little greater. And what are these systems? Well, so some of them are so kind of boring and workaday that I think they probably fly under the radar for a lot of people. But like, for example, housing markets. I don't understand why the market in Miami hasn't collapsed, and other places that are close, they're already getting sunny day floodings, they're getting hammered by stronger hurricanes, for example. I would not choose to buy a building, a house, or any kind of business or any kind of real estate in a market like that was already flooding. And so at some point, I think those real estate markets will probably collapse. I could see that as leading to maybe a collapse of the insurance and the reinsurance industry, which would then be bailed out with taxpayer money, right? So that's an example of collapse, which we already saw the financial markets collapse in 2008. So at some level, I think we all kind of know what that kind of collapse would feel like. We'd be living through it. We'd probably see the executives get, just like in 2008, literally get bigger bonuses as a result of this. No jail time for them, because again, they've captured the legal system and the financial system and the political system so thoroughly that they can kind of cause these collapse, and they can actually still figure out ways to accrue more capital. Look at the pandemic, right? It's made the billionaires even richer. It's been a way to funnel wealth and capital from the masses to the very tiny handful, just like a few dozens of the world's richest elite, right? And then a few hundreds more. Okay, so that's a kind of workaday example of how collapse might start to unfold. You'll see a reduction in social safety nets, right? Social security in the United States is already being challenged right now. You guys had what did you call it in Europe? It's not a word we use in the United States. Austerity measures, right? Which reduce the social safety net. You'll see education increasingly privatized. You'll see a rise in what are those things called? Those weird theories that people have that are wrong. Conspiracy theories, right? Which go out on the internet. You'll start to see different, like we said before, different tribes of people having their own sets of facts so that they can't even have discussion, and they start to get increasingly violent with each other, right? So you might start seeing a rupture of civility, which could, in some cases, start leading to civil wars, which we've already seen in certain parts of the world, right? But again, I don't think America is actually an exceptional place. And I think what we've learned over the last few months is that it's actually something that could potentially happen even in the United States, possibly in other countries, especially, when you have different groups of people that can't even talk to each other anymore, and you have kind of capture of those information systems, right? And then these different groups can diverge until they kind of come back together in a violent clash, right? Because they don't have a shared basis of experience and values anymore.
Yeah.
Then you see kind of more of the stuff that's classically talked about with kind of climate-driven collapse, which is you'll get crop failures maybe in different parts of the world at the same time. You'll start to see water scarcity, which could lead to conflict, for example, in India and Pakistan, perhaps. Those food scarcities will lead to higher food prices, which could lead to famines, which could lead to riots and civil wars and breakdown of civility, that we haven't seen before. You'll have more migrants moving up as the tropics become increasingly uninhabitable, which could lead to kind of an increase in nations in the cooler north building walls at their borders. We've already seen that, a rise in authoritarianism as their populace gets more afraid at perceived lack of abundance, right? Much of which is artificially created by the capitalists, right? Like I said, we have 40 to 50% of food waste in the United States, right? And yet most people think there's not enough food. That's artificial scarcity. So these are the kinds of things that I think could lead toward what we call societal collapse, which ultimately, which could unfold over many decades, which I would argue is already unfolding, beginning to unfold now. And at the end of the day, what you'll see maybe by the end of the century is a much hotter planet with a lot of places that used to have people and forests and animals that don't have those things anymore, which maybe they're being mined still, right? With like basically humans and like air-conditioned spacesuits just getting the minerals out from these tropical regions, which have basically hardly any life left anymore. And they need these spacesuits because it's so hot and humid. So I can imagine that like kind of by the end of the century. And then ultimately you just have fewer humans on the planet and you have less, industrial output. You might start to have, if the breakdown in civil society goes far enough, if we let it go far enough, then you have, more people with guns, less ability to kind of keep things secure, and sort of maybe more of a rise of, gang style warlords with, where the peasants are paying tributes to them to try to like, in exchange for this perceived protection. So to me, that's kind of the, maybe sort of the end game. But to get there, it's this path, very unpredictable, synergistic effects of geopolitics with food systems and water systems and insurance systems, et cetera. So it's very, I don't think it's very predictable, and I think it's going to be surprising. But what I do know is that it would lead to suffering on a scale that it's hard to imagine, and that I still think is largely avoidable, and which was certainly completely avoidable if we'd started actually having this discussion and facing this seriously, for example, in the 1980s or the 1990s. So that's why, I mean, again, I didn't think it was shouldn't have been controversial to sign that letter, because we haven't been talking about this stuff. And that I perceive that as a problem, to not talk about it. Like you said, it's like hiding our heads in the sand.
And I guess then that takes us quite neatly onto the doomist narrative, which I think is really, I've been going on and on about this for months to various people in our teams and speaking to other people outside of XR about it as well. But this, I had a really deep consideration about it today whilst I was out on my bicycle, and I was thinking about what is the question that I want to ask about this narrative, right? So for anybody who doesn't know, it's the term doomer or doomist or doomism being kind of chucked around like an insult, really, to describe a fictional person, as far as I can tell, because I think if these people existed, I would be working alongside some of them in the climate movement, and I don't think that I know any.
I think it's bollocks. I mean, personally, I do everything I can to constantly, like I'm constantly creatively trying to think of ways to create change more, and I just work like mad to do everything I can to stop this. And I understand that it's a continuum of badness, and it's a continuum of risk. That every day that we let this keep going, the risk of Greenland ice sheet kind of collapse increases. And it's this murky thing out in the future. We don't know where it's going to be, but we know that the risk gets bigger day after day. And there's any number of these tipping points all throughout the Earth system. And so the sooner we rein this in, the more we save. And even if things get a lot worse than this, I mean, I think this is going to remain just compared to like Mars or Venus or Mercury. This is just a bounteous oasis of life, even during a mass extinction event. It's just, to me, it's just, I'm so grateful for this planet, and to walk on this earth is such a miracle that I'll fight with my last breath to save whatever I can on this planet, for me, for all these other beings, for my kids. So I'm kind of more of a workist than and a save what you canist than a doomist. And you know, I don't know. To me, it's also incredibly, it brings a lot of meaning to my life. Like I never wonder, you know, what I should be doing. I don't have a bullshit job, you know. I don't go to work and feel like I'm wasting my time. This is all, my life has a very deep purpose, right? As I think many climate activists feel the same way. And that's also kind of like the opposite of doomism. Like we're this kind of like band of sort of warriors, if you will, kind of. I mean, it's deeply meaningful to be on this journey, and I wish there wasn't as much infighting. Maybe we'll get better at that. But I don't know. I don't descend into nihilism. Like I said before, I have bouts of anxiety which I manage, but I definitely don't feel nihilistic. To me, it would be deeply depressing to give up. I couldn't, I can't even almost imagine what that would feel like to give up and to know what was going on and to do nothing about it. I literally couldn't do that. Like there's no part of my psychology that would be, to me, that would be equivalent to suicide. Like I just couldn't function with this knowledge if I wasn't doing everything I can to stop it. So I think the doomism, it's a form of intellectual laziness. It's a form of actual laziness, because all of the stuff I do it does take an incredible amount of work, and like the stuff that you do and the other activists, it's genuinely laborious, right? To be an organizer and to do activism and to put your body on the line and to get arrested and even just to write, for example, or to have these conversations that we're having. It's certainly labor, for sure. So I think it's tempting. I think the doomism comes from a kind of denial where you just feel like you just don't want to think about it at all. And it's a convenient excuse to enable that not thinking about it. Like, oh, we're fucked anyway, so I'm just going to watch Netflix all the time. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to do other stuff. I just won't think about it. And I get that phrase over and over from different people, almost to the word. Like, oh, do you think about climate change, climate ecological breakdown? I just don't think about it. That's what a lot of people have said throughout this 15 years of being an activist. So I think, before this got so bad, before the kind of climate driven, catastrophes got as bad as they were, it was still possible to sort of go into this deeper state of denial and just say it's not happening. I won't think about it because it's not happening, or I won't, or like I did when I was a kid, like in 5th grade or something, when I first heard about what they called the greenhouse effect back then. And I'm like, oh, that's science fiction. That'll be long after I'm gone. I was an avid reader of science fiction at the time. So I wasn't worried about it. I just didn't think about it because it seemed so far in the future. Now that it's here, those people who before just didn't think about it because they thought it was comfortably far in the future, well, now it's here. So now some of them, at least, their way of just not thinking about it is doomism. So yeah, I when I tweeted that letter of we should maybe at least be having this conversation about possible societal collapse, which we don't even really know what that means. When I tweeted it, I said this couldn't be further from doomism, signing this letter, because I feel like having this conversation and being open to the real risks that we're facing will actually help us avoid those risks, not make those risks more likely. So it's, to me, signing that letter was a little thing that could possibly, was at least moving us in the direction, a tiny little bit, toward not having that kind of collapse, right? So it's anti-doomism. So yeah, I do think there are some people who are doomist, and there's people that talk about near-term human extinction, which I don't think is a real thing. I don't see any evidence for that. We are in an extinction crisis. Every species that goes extinct, to me, is a kind of climate and ecological tipping point that should have been avoided, an irreversible tipping point. But I don't see any evidence for near-term human extinction. I see evidence for human suffering, near-term human suffering, because it's present, it's here now. You already have people dying from climate and ecological breakdown and suffering and losing their homes and losing their livelihoods and becoming migrants and becoming this kind of global underclass of unwanted people without homes. So, so yeah, you know, I don't know. I, I hope that signing that letter doesn't make people think I'm a doomist, because I don't, I know a lot of climate activists and I see what people are doing. And it's hard for me to think that I could do more to be an anti-doomist, right? I just don't. Anyway, but who knows? People have their narratives, and you know, I think those kinds of letters, ultimately, what they do, that letter, I don't think it explicitly called out the need to scrutinize and stop this this kind of billionaireism, this growthism. But ultimately, that's what, right now, I think that's the frontier of the movement. Like I said, is we have to start talking about ending this destructive form of economic organization, which for convenience we call capitalism. And there's so much misunderstanding around that word. You know, so I think I will probably be attacked quite a bit for trying to shine a light on what I see as a very kind of deadly, you know, historically it's pretty undeniable for anyone who actually looks at the history of this form of economic organization objectively. Like, it's been objectively destructive and deadly and, you know, suffering inducing. So yeah, I you know, I think we need to kind of come out from these myths that we tell ourselves to perpetuate it. And that's, you know, it's always uncomfortable being trying to shift culture like that, right? Because culture doesn't want to be shifted, it has its own inertia. So if you're too comfortable, if you're getting all of the awards from the organizations, then you're probably not doing it right? Because they want to uphold the status quo. So you know, it's uncomfortable. It sucks that we do all of this work, and yet, you know, we get these labels, which I think are ultimately coming to try to get us to stop doing this work because it's threatening to the status quo. But that's the way it is, and you know, we need to support each other, because it can be a lonely and thankless and just tiring task at times, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I've just this weekend I've been feeling very tired, and I'm not sure whether I'm okay or not. You know, I'm exhausted, and I think the last kind of 3 years have been, you know, insane experience for me, and very, very tiring. And I think, you know, I'm really conscious at the moment of the sort of toll that it takes on us all doing all this work, and doing so much additional work to, like, the ordinary work that you have to do to just stay afloat or pay the rent or do whatever it is that you've got to do in terms of, you know, providing for your own sort of real life. This work just gives you this humongous, like, and never ever going to get finished to-do list of things to do, right?
It does.
And at the same time under pressure, because we know that we're, as you say, we're in negative time. It's not like, oh, we've got, you know, I worried a lot when people started to throw around that, like, we've got 10 years to save the planet, or we've got 12 years to save the planet. I was like, we've got like minus 30 fucking years to save the planet. Like,
we get a deadline that's when we get a new deadline, which is a week away, we feel like, oh, it's a whole week away, you know, party time. You know, that's just the way humans act, right? So to say that, to have this, just to give people an impression that there's this deadline 10 years away is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. But anyway, so I'm going to try and, like, rest up a bit over the holiday time.
That's good, and I think that's a good place to end, because the more I keep doing this too, and I see great activists getting burnt out, and you know, sometimes they can even get to the point where they become more of a drag on the movement because they're so burnt out that other activists get concerned for their well-being, their literal physical well-being. And then that makes the rest of us get anxious and stressed out. So when you look at it that way, what it says very, very clearly is that as activists, we have to also constantly be savvy about our well-being and take what we need to maintain our own mental and physical and economic health, so that we can keep going and so that we don't get burnt out and so that we don't become a drag on our fellow activists. At the same time, it's like geese flying in a V formation, right? Sometimes we can spend some time at the front, really on the vanguard, like you've been doing with Extinction Rebellion. And it's so tiring to be right up there on the front lines. And then you might have to go back a little bit and let some other people be flying in the front, right? So that, sorry. I just, sorry, I got overcome by gratitude, actually, for what you're doing. It's just how hard it is. So, yeah, see, that's what I mean. Like, it comes at really unexpected times, but I just felt an incredible connection to you and gratitude for what you're doing. So yeah, so, take care of yourself. We got to take care of each other. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
it's hard. So
yeah,
sorry. It doesn't usually actually come out like in tears that I can't control like that. But I just I think the people that are putting their bodies and their livelihoods and their time and energy on the line right now are just such heroes, and are so the fact that they're vilified by the rest of society, is just so heartbreaking. But we have to hold each other up and keep taking care of ourselves and each other, I guess.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you, Peter. All right. Well, I'm sending you like a huge hug. And
lots of meta to you too. Lots of loving kindness, and yeah. So thanks for taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So nice to talk to you.
Likewise. All right. Bye.
Bye.